Shouldn't we be able to just look at something and paint it exactly as it is? Of course, the artwork we create is never an exact replica of the external world, and only some of this is determined by our skill level and technique. The rest is an intricate process of observing and interpreting what we see through the lens of our individual experiences, emotions, and stylistic preferences. In this video, I want to explore this interplay between what we see and how we choose to translate it on canvas or paper using my recent botanical study. As always, I will show you the full flower painting step by step, sharing my exact thought process, explain the watercolor techniques I choose to apply, and mention my favorite art supplies that help me recreate the picture I see in the best way I can. As I'm sketching my composition, I wanted to give a shout out to one of my Patreon subscribers, Jill, whose recent message gave me an idea for this video. She asked me specifically to explain the thought process behind my paintings using a simple step-by-step example from a reference photo to the final watercolor, and it got me thinking about this whole topic of how we recreate what we see through the medium of watercolor and the choices we make along the way. So here's my reference photo, a beautiful rose I stumbled upon during one of my walks. I linked the reference photo in the video description below, so feel free to use it for your own practice. And the first thing I notice is this interplay of two colors, yellow and red. It's what attracted me to this flower in the first place, and while I marvel at this beautiful contrast, the logical part of my brain is telling me that I can't capture both colors at once. I have to layer them separately, starting with the lightest one, the yellow, and then I can follow with my reds afterwards. I'm using cadmium yellow medium hue from Daniel Smith, which is technically more than enough to create this first layer, but I'm also adding splashes of very juicy, very saturated Hansa Yellow Deep, something that is only necessary if you really want to emphasize how vibrant this yellow looks on a bright sunny day. Which brings me to point number one. What we see is a very subjective and filtered version of reality. As artists, we have the freedom to change things, leave out certain details and exaggerate others, using specific materials and techniques to make a point and create a certain feeling. So the yellow hues I'm recreating here are not a perfect copy of reality, but rather my own personal interpretation with a focus on extremely vibrant, almost orangey yellow. In someone else's version, which would also be correct, this first layer could have been much more muted, much lighter. But that's not my style and not what I'm attracted to in this flower. So here we are with our very vibrant first layer of yellow and a little bit of cooler red that I've added using wet on wet technique on the bottom petals, just to give us some beginnings of the flower shape. My second layer of color is red, and I'm applying it very lightly at first, mostly around the edges of the petals using wet on dry technique, meaning wet red paint is going on top of the dry yellow layer. Once I figure out how far I want the red color to go on a particular petal, I start adding more saturated pigment using wet on damp technique, meaning much more concentrated red color on top of the damp light red surface. This allows me to capture subtle variations in red values, meaning light and dark red areas, within a single petal. I have an entire tutorial on wet on damp technique here on YouTube and on my Patreon channel, which I will link in the video description below. But don't click on it just yet, because I know that some of you may be wondering how my paper is staying wet for so long. Let me tell you, my secret weapon is this synthetic oxgall from Golden Paints. I add a few drops to my water before I start painting so I can extend the drying time. The only reason why I'm able to work on wet surface for several minutes at a time is this watercolor medium and of course my cotton paper. This effect wouldn't work on any regular paper, and that's important to note. My other secret weapon is, of course, this super precise synthetic brush from Escoda. It's called Chronos, and mine is in size 2, which brings me to my second point. Painting is essentially translating what we see into a different language, the language of art. And our choice of art tools contributes to how this translation process occurs and how well we're able to bridge the gap, so to speak, between what we see and what we paint. The combination of precise brushwork and very light, translucent, water-based paint is helping me recreate the exact feeling I've experienced when I first saw this flower. The fine balance between sharp petal edges and soft color transitions within each petal. I often work with ink and digital applications, especially for my commercial projects like the silver and gold Canadian dollar coins that I designed for the Royal Canadian Mint. And the flowers I create using those tools look completely different because my medium of choice is not the same. Of course, the quality of our artwork is not solely determined by the tools we use, but also by our experience and familiarity with those tools. A skilled artist can create exceptional work even with basic tools, while beginners might struggle, which is why consistent practice and experimentation is so essential for making progress. In fact, when I was painting the second flower, I reached out for my oldest brush just for fun. This brush is 30 years old and I made it myself as a teenager using PVA glue, a wooden stick, and a little bit of hair that I borrowed from my cat. Not exactly the same as using a good synthetic brush, but I like to play around sometimes, and it makes me appreciate the tools I do have right now and understand my own limitations and areas of opportunity as far as my technique goes. I will now finish the rose by applying one more layer of darker reds, this time using semi-transparent alizarin crimson and even a cooler, almost violet Bordeaux from Daniel Smith. The whole process took me almost 2 hours and I barely even touched the shadows, which may seem counterintuitive because shadows, of course, is what helps us create a sense of three-dimensional form on two-dimensional sheet of paper. Without the shadows, our objects can look quite flat and artificial, but I made a decision right from the beginning to focus my efforts on recreating this beautiful interplay between yellow and red to the best of my ability, and to skip or simplify the underlying differences in values that emerge between the petals, and even ignore some of the cast shadows that may be coming from surrounding objects, which is my third and final point. Just as we make deliberate choices about what to emphasize in our paintings, we also make choices about what to omit or how to manipulate the elements in our artwork to convey a certain message or to evoke certain emotions. I focus a lot on recreating accurate shadows when my compositions feature more monochromatic subjects, like for example these dusty roses from a recent video, and I've linked it below, but in this particular case, I almost completely skipped the shadows and created something much more flat and maybe even decorative on purpose, because what I wanted to highlight was this contrast between yellow and red. The rest was simply not important and, in my opinion, would make the composition too busy. This may not be my most successful watercolor. I'm yet to finish the birds and the second rose, but as always, the final result matters a lot less than the process itself. The hours we spend painting are valuable regardless of the outcome, because watercolor, just like any other medium, is a lifelong journey of creative expression. The difference between what we see and what we paint lies not just in our tools and skill level, but also in our unique point of view and interpretation of reality. We get better with every stroke, translating what we see in the real world into our unique vision, one painting at a time. The decisions we make along the way help us become more familiar with particular tools and techniques and help us develop our signature style, our unique point of view, and that is the real value of creative practice. I'm going to pause this study for now, take everything I've learned, and work on a new tutorial featuring roses for my Patreon subscribers. Rose is the birth flower of June, and we have this theme going with birth month flowers. You can check out the April Sweet Pea watercolor and May Lily of the Valley here on YouTube and on my Patreon channel in real time. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful week ahead, and I will see you soon.